Rancher buys old barn for 22 cents, then finds 3 girls hanged inside. The rancher had lived in the small countryside town for most of his life. His name was Daniel Carter, and he was known as a quiet, hard-working man who kept to himself. His days were usually simple. He woke up before sunrise, fed his cattle, checked his fences, and spent long hours working under the open sky. Life on the ranch was not easy, but Daniel liked it that way. He believed honest work and patience could solve most problems. One afternoon, while Daniel was buying supplies at the local store, he overheard 2 men talking in low voices near the counter. They were discussing an old barn that sat on a piece of land outside town. The barn had been empty for many years and no one wanted it. The owner, an elderly man who had moved away, wanted to get rid of it as quickly as possible. The price they mentioned sounded almost unreal. Daniel did not plan to listen, but the number caught his attention. The barn was being sold for just a few cents. At first, he thought it was a joke. Property, even old and broken, usually cost much more. He turned slightly and listened more carefully. The men said the place had a bad reputation, and that was why no one wanted to buy it. They laughed nervously, as if they did not want to say more. Curiosity slowly grew inside Daniel. He had been looking for extra storage space for hay and old equipment. His ranch was growing, and he needed more room. A cheap barn, even an old one, could be useful. Still, the strange tone of the men's voices made him uncomfortable. People in small towns talked, and when they avoided a place, there was usually a reason. That evening, Daniel asked around. He spoke to a few neighbors and mentioned the old barn casually. The reactions were all the same. Some people changed the subject quickly. Others shrugged and said it was better to stay away from that land. One older woman at the diner looked at him with worried eyes and said, "Some places carry heavy stories. Not every cheap deal is a good deal." Those words stayed in Daniel's mind, but he was a practical man. He believed in seeing things with his own eyes instead of trusting rumors. The next day, he decided to drive out and take a look at the barn himself. The road leading to the property was narrow and covered with dust. Tall grass had grown on both sides, and the trees looked thick and wild, as if no one had cared for the land in a long time. The barn came into view slowly. Its red paint had faded to a dull brown. Some boards were loose, and part of the roof looked like it had started to sink. Daniel parked his truck and stepped out. The air felt different there. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds were singing nearby, and even the wind seemed softer. He stood for a moment, just looking at the building. It was old, but it was still standing. With some repairs, it could be useful. He walked around the barn, checking the walls and doors. The wood was rough under his hand, and the smell of old hay and dust filled the air. There were signs that the barn had not been used for many years. Weeds grew close to the walls, and spider webs covered the corners of the doors. Daniel tried the main door. It creaked loudly as he pushed it open. The sound echoed inside, making the space feel larger and emptier than it really was. Sunlight came through small cracks in the walls and roof, creating thin lines of light on the dusty floor. Inside, he saw old farming tools, broken chairs, and empty boxes. Everything looked forgotten, like time had stopped there. Daniel walked slowly, careful where he stepped. The floor was uneven in places, and he did not want to fall through a weak board. As he explored, he noticed something that made him pause. There were marks on some of the wooden beams, as if ropes or heavy objects had once been tied there long ago. He could not tell exactly what they were for, but they made him uneasy. It was not normal for a simple storage barn. He shook his head and told himself he was thinking too much. Old barns were used for many things over the years. Animals, tools, and even repairs could leave strange marks. Still, a small feeling of discomfort stayed with him. After looking around for nearly an hour, Daniel went back to his truck. He sat there for a few minutes, thinking. The barn was cheap. The land could be useful. From a business point of view, it made sense. But from a personal point of view, something felt off. That night, Daniel could not sleep well. He kept thinking about the quiet road, the empty barn, and the way people in town avoided talking about it. He told himself he was being foolish, but fear based on rumors was not how he lived his life. He believed in making his own choices. The next morning he called the number he had been given for the owner's agent. The man on the phone sounded tired and eager to finish the deal quickly. He did not ask many questions and seemed almost relieved that someone was finally interested. They agreed on the small price. It felt strange to buy property for such a tiny amount, but the papers were real. Within a short time, the barn officially belonged to Daniel. When the news spread in town, people reacted in different ways. Some were surprised. Others were silent. A few tried to warn him gently. One man at the gas station said, "You got it cheap for a reason." When Daniel asked what he meant, the man just shook his head and walked away. Daniel told himself he would clean the barn and make it useful. He planned to store hay there and maybe fix the roof when he had time. He believed that once he put some work into it, the strange feelings would go away. On the first full day after the purchase, Daniel drove out early in the morning. The sun was just rising, and the sky was painted with soft orange and pink colors. He wanted to start fresh and make the place his own. He unlocked the door and stepped inside again. The dust rose into the air as he walked, catching the sunlight. He began moving old boxes and broken furniture, creating small piles near the walls. As he worked, he found small personal items: an old shoe, a piece of fabric, and a broken hair clip. These things did not belong to farming tools. Daniel stopped and looked at the items in his hand. They felt out of place. He could not explain why, but they made his chest feel heavy. Who had been here before? Why were these things left behind? He sat on an old crate for a moment, holding his hat in his hands. The barn was no longer just an old building. It felt like it held a story that had never been finished. The silence inside the barn felt thick, as if it was holding secrets. Daniel was not a man who scared easily, but he respected his instincts. Something about this place was more than just age and neglect. It felt like the barn had been forgotten on purpose. Still, he did not want to jump to conclusions. He told himself to stay calm and think clearly. The right thing to do was to continue carefully and not disturb anything that looked important. As he stood up to continue working, he made a quiet promise to himself. If he found anything that seemed serious or connected to people, he would not handle it alone. He would contact the proper people and make sure everything was done the right way. What started as a simple, cheap purchase was slowly turning into something much heavier. Daniel could feel it deep inside. The barn was not just a building, but it was a doorway to a past that the town had tried to forget. And though he did not know it yet, this first step into the old barn would soon change not only his life, but also the life of the entire community. The next day, Daniel returned to the barn with a different feeling in his heart. What had once seemed like a simple project now felt serious. He brought gloves, a flashlight, and a notebook. He wanted to be careful and organized. He told himself that if the barn truly held a forgotten story, he needed to treat it with respect. As he unlocked the door, The familiar creaking sound echoed again. The air inside felt colder than before, even though the weather outside was warm. Dust floated in the beam of his flashlight. Every small sound seemed louder in the quiet space. Daniel began by checking areas he had not explored deeply the day before. Behind a stack of old wooden boards, he found a small side room that looked like it had once been used as a storage area. The door was partly broken, and he had to push hard to open it. Inside the small room, there were more boxes, most of them damaged by time and moisture. When Daniel opened one, he found old papers. Some were too faded to read clearly, but others had names written on them. The handwriting looked careful, like someone had taken time to write neatly. He did not understand what the papers were for, but seeing names made everything feel more real. This was not just an empty building. Real people had spent time here. They had left pieces of their lives behind. Daniel wrote a few notes in his notebook. He did not want to forget what he saw. He believed that details mattered. Even small things could help explain the bigger picture later. As he continued to clean, he found more personal items. A small bracelet, a cracked mirror, and a notebook with only a few pages still attached. The rest had been torn out long ago. The remaining pages were blank, but the cover was worn, as if it had been carried often. Daniel held the notebook in his hands for a long time. He tried to imagine who it had belonged to. A young person? A worker? Someone passing through town? The questions filled his mind, but there were no answers. He felt a growing sense of responsibility. These were not just objects to throw away. They were signs of human stories. He placed the items carefully in a box instead of tossing them aside. While moving an old cabinet, Daniel noticed scratches on the floor beneath it. They looked like something heavy had been dragged many times. The marks were old, but still clear. He followed them with his eyes, trying to see where they led. The scratches ended near a support beam. Daniel looked up at the beam and noticed more marks there too. Again, he could not say exactly what they were for, but they did not look like normal farm wear and tear. His heart began to beat faster. The barn felt different now. It no longer felt like a place for animals or tools. It felt like a place where something serious had happened long ago. Daniel stepped back and took a deep breath. He reminded himself not to panic. Fear could make people imagine things that were not true. Still, his instincts told him this was more than imagination. He decided to take photos of the strange marks and the items he found. He wanted a clear record in case he needed to show someone later. He used his phone and took careful pictures from different angles. As the day went on, the light inside the barn changed. The sun moved, and the long shadows made the beams and walls look taller and more serious. The silence felt heavy, like the barn was watching him. At one point, Daniel thought he heard a faint noise, like a soft step or a small movement. He froze and listened. But after a moment, he realized it was probably just the wood settling or an animal outside. Still, the moment left him feeling uneasy. He decided to step outside for some fresh air. The open sky felt good after the closed space of the barn. He drank some water and leaned against his truck, looking back at the building. From the outside, the barn looked harmless, just old wood and peeling paint. But Daniel now knew that buildings could hide more than what they showed. While standing there, a neighbor drove by slowly and stopped. It was an older man named Mr. Harris, who had lived in the area for many years. He rolled down his window and looked at Daniel with a serious expression. "I heard you bought this place," Mr. Harris said. Daniel nodded. "Yes, just for storage. It was cheap." Mr. Harris was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "People don't like to talk about this land, not because of ghosts or stories like that, but because of real pain." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "What kind of pain?" he asked. "Mr. West." Harris shook his head. "Long ago, some young people went missing in this area. The town searched, but nothing clear was ever found. Over time, people stopped asking questions. Life moved on, but some of us never forgot." Daniel thanked him for sharing and watched as Mr. Harris drove away. The words stayed in his mind: missing young people, forgotten questions. The barn suddenly felt like a key to something much bigger. Daniel went back inside, but now he moved more slowly and carefully. He felt like he was walking through someone else's memories. Every object felt important. In one corner, he found a small area where the floorboards were slightly loose. He did not pull them up, but he marked the spot in his notebook. He did not want to damage anything. If this place was part of an old case, it was not his job to investigate it alone. By late afternoon, Daniel felt emotionally tired. His body was not as tired as his mind. The barn had taken more from him than physical energy. It had filled his thoughts with questions and concern. He sat on a wooden step near the entrance and thought about what to do next. He could ignore everything and just use the barn as planned. But he knew he would not be able to live with himself if he did that. Daniel believed in doing what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. If this place held answers about people who had never been found, then those answers mattered. He decided that the next step was to contact local officials and share what he had found, not in a dramatic way, but in a calm and respectful way. He would show them the items, the photos, and the notes he had taken. At night, back at his ranch house, Daniel spread his notebook and photos across his kitchen table. He looked at each picture carefully: the marks on the beams, the scratches on the floor, the personal items. Together, they told a story without words. He felt a mix of fear, sadness, and determination. Fear because he did not know what he might uncover. Sadness for the people who might have been connected to this place. Determination because he believed the truth, even after many years, still mattered. As he turned off the lights and went to bed, Daniel knew that the barn was no longer just a piece of property. It had become a responsibility. The quiet building on the dusty road was slowly opening a door to the past. And Daniel was now standing at that door, ready to help bring long-hidden answers into the light. The following morning, Daniel made a decision that he could no longer delay. He drove into town earlier than usual, not to buy supplies, but to visit the local office. His hands felt heavy on the steering wheel, and his mind kept replaying everything he had seen in the barn. The marks, the personal items, and Mr. Harris's words about young people who had gone missing all stayed with him. When he arrived, he spoke calmly and explained that he had recently bought an old barn and had found things that did not seem normal for a farm building. He did not make any strong claims. He simply shared facts. He showed the photos on his phone and explained where he had found each item. The officers listened carefully. One of them, a woman with kind but serious eyes, nodded as she looked through the pictures. She said that sometimes old properties were connected to cases that had never been fully solved. She thanked Daniel for coming forward instead of ignoring what he had found. Within a short time, a small team agreed to visit the barn with him. Daniel felt a strange mix of relief and worry. Relief because he was no longer carrying this alone. Worry because he knew that once others stepped into that barn, the story would move forward in ways he could not control. That afternoon, 2 vehicles followed Daniel down the dusty road to the barn. The quiet land suddenly felt different, with more people there. The sound of doors closing and footsteps on gravel broke the long silence that had surrounded the place for years. The team walked through the barn slowly. They asked Daniel to point out the areas he had noticed. He showed them the beams, the scratches on the floor, and the small room with the boxes and papers. They took notes, photos, and measurements. Everything was done carefully and respectfully. As they worked, one of the officers mentioned that the town had a few old missing person records that were never fully closed. The files were old, and many people who were involved had either moved away or passed on. Still, the names were there, waiting in dusty folders. Hearing this made the situation feel more real to Daniel. These were not just rumors anymore. These were real people with real families who had waited for answers for many years. Word spread quickly in a small town. By the next day, people were talking. Some were curious. Some were nervous. Some were emotional. The old barn, which had been ignored for so long, was suddenly the center of quiet conversations in diners, shops, and homes. An older woman named Mrs. Lowell came to see Daniel at his ranch. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane, but her eyes were sharp. She told him that many years ago, her niece had disappeared while traveling through the area. The family had searched and hoped, but over time, hope had turned into painful silence. "I don't know if it's connected," she said softly, "but I want to thank you for not looking away." Her words touched Daniel deeply. He realized that for many families, time had not healed the pain. It had only made it quieter. Over the next several days, more people came forward. Some shared small memories. Others shared things they had heard long ago but were too afraid to talk about at the time. None of the stories were clear on their own, but together they formed a picture of a past the town had tried to forget. The barn was officially closed off for careful examination. Daniel was asked not to enter while the team did their work. It felt strange to see yellow tape and official signs on a building he had just bought. It no longer felt like his barn. It felt like a doorway to many unfinished stories. At night, Daniel found it hard to sleep. He kept thinking about the people connected to the items he had found. Who had worn the bracelet? Who had used the notebook? What dreams had they had before their lives changed? He also thought about the town. For years, people had carried these stories quietly. Fear, shame, and uncertainty had kept many silent. Now, the silence was finally breaking. One evening, Mr. Harris visited again. This time, he stayed longer. They sat on the porch, watching the sun go down over the fields. "I was younger back then," Mr. Harris said. "People talked, but no one wanted trouble. Some folks knew more than they said. Others were just scared. Small towns can be kind, but they can also hide things." Daniel listened carefully. He did not judge. He understood that fear could make people stay quiet, even when staying quiet was wrong. Days turned into a week. The investigation continued quietly but steadily. Officials reviewed old records, matched names, and compared dates. The barn became a piece of a larger puzzle. One afternoon, Daniel was called in for an update. The officer with kind eyes explained that some of the items and records did match old missing person cases. It did not give full answers yet, but it confirmed that the barn was connected to something serious from the past. Daniel felt a heavy weight in his chest. There was sadness in knowing that the barn truly was part of a painful history. But there was also a strange sense of purpose. Because of his simple decision to buy a cheap, forgotten building, long hidden stories were finally being heard. The town began to change in small ways. People spoke more openly. Old arguments were set aside. There was a shared feeling that something important was happening. even if it was difficult. Daniel noticed that people treated him differently now, not with fear, but with respect. They saw him as someone who had chosen to do the right thing instead of the easy thing. At the same time, he struggled with his own emotions. He was a rancher, not a hero. He had not planned to be part of something so serious. But life sometimes placed people in situations they never expected. One evening, as he walked near his fields, Daniel looked up at the wide sky and he thought about how many years had passed with no answers for some families. He thought about how time could move forward while pain stayed behind. He made a quiet promise to himself again. He would continue to cooperate fully. He would not rush things. He would let the truth come out in its own time. The barn, once just a cheap purchase, had now become a symbol of hidden stories, a symbol of long silence, and now, slowly, a symbol of truth coming into the open. Daniel did not know what the final answers would be, but he knew one thing for sure. The past was no longer buried. The road ahead would not be easy for the town or for the families connected to the old cases. But for the first time in many years, there was movement, there was attention, there was hope that the truth, even if painful, would finally be known. And as Daniel stood at the edge of his land, looking toward the distant barn, he understood that this journey was far from over. The next steps would be even heavier, but they would also be necessary. The old barn had opened a door. Now, the town had to walk through it together. Time passed, and slowly the town began to change. What had started as quiet talks turned into open conversations. People who had kept their feelings locked inside for years finally found the courage to speak. The old fear that once filled the streets began to fade, replaced by a shared wish for peace and understanding. Daniel watched this change with a heavy but hopeful heart. He never wanted attention. He never wanted to be the center of such a serious story. But he understood now that sometimes ordinary people are placed in extraordinary situations for a reason. The investigation continued quietly. Officials worked carefully, reviewing old files, talking to families, and connecting pieces that had been scattered for years. They treated everything with respect. There were no loud announcements, no drama, just steady, serious work to bring long-awaited answers. For many families, even small updates meant everything. A name found in a record, a date that matched, a place finally connected to a story. By job, these small steps helped turn years of questions into something clearer. It did not erase the pain, but it helped people understand what had happened and why. One afternoon, a small gathering was held in town. It was not a big event, just a quiet moment for people to come together. There were flowers, soft words, and long hugs. Some people cried. Others simply stood in silence. The air was filled with emotion, but also with respect. Daniel stood near the back, not wanting to take focus away from the families. He listened as people shared memories of loved ones, stories of laughter, dreams, and plans that were never finished. These were not just names in old files. These were real people who had been deeply loved. For the first time, the town truly faced its past, not with fear, but with honesty. People admitted that staying silent had not helped. They saw that facing the truth, even when it hurt, was the only way to move forward. The old barn was no longer just a forgotten building. It became a symbol, not of fear, but of truth, not of silence, but of courage. The town decided together that the place would be treated with dignity. It would not be ignored again. Daniel worked with local leaders to make sure the land was cared for properly. The barn was cleaned and secured. Some suggested turning the space into a simple memorial area, not something big, but something meaningful. A place where people could remember and reflect. At first, Daniel was unsure. He had bought the barn for storage, not for history, but he understood that it no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to the town's story. He agreed to support the idea. As the days passed, Daniel noticed something else changing. He felt different inside. The heavy weight he had carried since first stepping into the barn slowly began to lift. It did not disappear, but it became easier to carry. He had done what he believed was right. He had not turned away. He had not pretended not to see. That gave him a quiet sense of peace. People in town began to thank him, not loudly, not in big speeches, but in small ways. A kind word at the store, a note left on his truck, a handshake that lasted a little longer than usual. One older man said to him, "You helped us face something we were too afraid to face. That takes courage." Daniel did not feel brave. He just felt human. He had followed his instincts and his sense of right and wrong. But hearing those words reminded him that small actions could lead to big changes. At home on his ranch, life slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The cattle still needed feeding. The fences still needed fixing. The land still needed care. These simple tasks helped ground him. They reminded him that life continued, even after heavy moments. But Daniel was not the same man he had been before. He was more thoughtful, more aware of how the past could shape the present. He understood now that history was not just something in books. It lived in people, in places, and in the quiet spaces between words. One evening, Daniel drove out to the barn alone. The sun was setting, painting the sky with soft colors. The building looked calmer somehow, less heavy, less filled with silence. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, listening to the sounds of nature. Birds in the distance, wind moving through the grass. The world felt peaceful. He thought about how a simple, almost meaningless purchase had changed so many lives. How something bought for a few cents had opened a door to years of hidden truth. Life worked in strange ways. Daniel whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for the families, for peace in their hearts, for strength in their days ahead, for comfort in knowing that their loved ones were finally remembered and honored. The town slowly found a new balance. The old fear was replaced by a new kind of strength. People learned that facing the past did not make them weak. It made them honest. Children grew up hearing gentle versions of the story, not to scare them, but to teach them the importance of speaking up, caring for others, and never ignoring something that felt wrong. The barn stood quietly, no longer forgotten. It was a reminder that truth, even when buried for years, could still come to light. A reminder that one person's choice could help many others find peace. Daniel returned to his truck and drove home under the darkening sky. His life was still simple, still full of early mornings and hard work, but it was also richer in a way he had never expected. He had learned that being part of something bigger did not mean being famous or powerful. Sometimes it simply meant being willing to look, to listen, and to act when something did not feel right. As the town moved forward, so did Daniel. He carried the story with him, not as a burden, but as a lesson. a lesson about courage, responsibility, and the quiet power of doing the right thing. And in that small countryside town, the past was no longer just a shadow. It had been faced, it had been honored, and slowly it had been transformed into a path toward healing. What began as a cheap, forgotten barn became a turning point, not just for Daniel, but for an entire community.